This is the second in a series of videos examining gender and sexuality in Indigenous cultures. See the first video in this series for the context. This video will look at the relationship between Indigenous views of gender and sexuality and contemporary Western or Global North views. The complexity of this subject requires an analysis from several perspectives, and you'll find timestamps in the video description to help you navigate the content. The main point of this video requires some preparation to address, so the first section will take some time to do this. Having spent 9 years doing volunteer work in local Indigenous communities, I know from personal experience that discussions of the interaction and interchange of language and values between Indigenous and non-Indigenous cultures, particularly those of colonizers, is fraught with complexity and tension, and that Indigenous communities themselves are virtually never a cohesive, monolithic group with a single shared view. Consequently, I intend to tread slowly and carefully through my arguments in this video, and I welcome comments engaging with or contesting my statements. However, if it feels like the start of this video is beginning to drag because it's nothing new to you, or you don't see the point of it, or for any other reason, just use the timestamps in the description to skip to the next section. The topic to be addressed in this first section is the fact that citizens in so-called modern Western nations enjoy gender and sexuality rights which most people in the world do not have. The precise definition of Western nations is open to debate, which is just one of the reasons why I prefer not to use it, but the term is still used widely by nations and cultures which identify themselves as non-Western, so this term will have currency for the foreseeable future. People from the United Kingdom and the rest of Western Europe, as well as North America, Australia and New Zealand, are typically identified as Western by people living outside those regions, and the culture and values they hold to are described as Western culture and Western values. And this is why I'm introducing this term at this point, because later we'll be looking at sources which refer explicitly to Western values from the outgroup perspective of people who view themselves as non-Western. So it's important to understand who and what they mean by this term. All the nations thus identified as Western have an extremely bad historical human rights record, both in regard to their own people and to everyone else's, and gender and sexuality rights in Western nations have taken centuries to develop towards greater egalitarianism. Nevertheless, citizens of modern Western nations now have the privilege of legal access to gender and sexuality rights which most people in the world do not have. Those rights were the product of the slow, gradual, and often painful development of Western socio-cultural and ethical values. At this point, it will be helpful to drop the rather ambiguous and arguably non-useful term Western nations and replace it with a more academically rigorous and objectively defined term North-South divide, which includes both Western nations and some non-Western nations. The North-South divide is a term describing the obvious division in socio-economic and political development between countries located in the global North and those located in the global South. This map illustrates the North-South divide. In the north are North America, the United Kingdom and Europe, including Turkey and the Baltic states, and Russia, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand. These nations are identified as having higher socio-economic and political development. In the south are Central and South America, Africa, the Middle East, the subcontinent including India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, North Korea, China, Mongolia, and the nations in the Southeast Pacific region such as Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Micronesian and Polynesian Isles. These nations are identified as having lower socio-economic and political development. The historical reasons for this divide are complex, though northern colonization and imperialism are a significant contributing factor, and are off topic for this video. Most relevant to this video is the fact that the North-South divide is not merely socio-economic and political, but also ethical and legal. Human rights are overwhelmingly more protected and upheld in the global North than they are in the global South. Again, the historical reasons for this are complex and won't be discussed in detail here. For the purpose of this video, it is sufficient to illustrate the fact using a number of metrics. First, let's look at slavery. In the global north, nations which had previously legalized slavery had all abolished it by the end of the 19th century. Some nations in the global north never legalized slavery. In contrast, in the global south, nations which had previously legalized slavery were much slower to abolish it. Most of the nations in the global south which had previously legalized slavery did not abolish it until halfway through the 20th century, and some did not abolish it until near the end of that century. Secondly, let's look at modern-day slavery, comprising coercive economic and labor practices which institutionalize an effective state of slavery, despite the actual abolition of traditional slavery. Again, looking at this map, we see that modern slavery overwhelmingly persists in the global south, while it has been virtually eliminated in the global north, with significant exceptions in Eastern Europe. Thirdly, let's look at human rights. We will consider this from three different aspects: human rights legislation, actual human rights outcomes, and harassment of human rights activists. This first map shows that nations in the global north typically have far more developed human rights legislation than nations in the global south. This second map shows that citizens in the global north typically have far better actual human rights outcomes than citizens in the global south. This third map shows that human rights activists typically experience far more harassment in the global south than they do in the global north. Fourthly, and most relevant to the topic of this video, let's look at gender equity and sexuality. We will consider this from three different aspects: gender equity legislation, gender equity outcomes, and sexual orientation legislation. This first map shows that nations in the global north typically have far more developed gender equity legislation than nations in the global south. This second map shows that citizens in the global north typically have far better actual gender equity outcomes than citizens in the global south. This third map shows that nations in the global north typically have far more developed sexual orientation legislation than nations in the global south. In fact, this map shows that virtually every nation in the global south criminalizes consensual same-sex behavior, with most of them punishing it by imprisonment and some punishing it by death. The North-South ethics divide is the product of a number of interacting factors, but there are a few factors which stand out as particularly influential. Contrary to expectation, in this case, colonization and imperialism are contributing factors, but not determinative factors. Nations of the global south which were colonized by, or were the product of colonization by, nations from the global north often have better gender equity and sexual orientation equity than nations in the global south which did not experience global north colonization. For example, Israel, South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, the Philippines, and most nations in both Central and South America all have sexual orientation protection legislation which typically equals, or nearly equals, those of other nations in the global north. In contrast, in some cases, global south nations which were colonized by global north nations have deliberately passed laws in order to reduce sexual orientation equity since becoming independent. For example, French colonies in Africa inherited the French legal system, which did not criminalize homosexual acts. However, a number of those African ex-colonies have criminalized homosexual acts since becoming independent. Additionally, some African nations which used to be British colonies have not only deliberately kept anti-gay legislation after becoming independent, but have even added to it and reduced LGBTQ rights even further. In the same way, outside Africa, there are global south nations which were never colonized by global north nations, but which have far less developed LGBTQ rights than global north nations. On the other hand, those global south nations which have adopted more developed LGBTQ rights are typically those which have also adopted more of the cultural views and values of global north nations. The most reliable predictor of gender and sexuality rights legislation in a nation in the global south is the extent to which it has adopted so-called Western values, regardless of whether it was colonized or not. Religion has been another contributing factor. Comparing this map of LGBTQ rights in Africa with this map showing the proportion of Christian and Muslim populations in Africa, it is clear that Muslim majority nations in Africa overwhelmingly tend to have fewer LGBTQ rights than Christian majority nations. Additionally, the African nations with the most developed LGBTQ rights tend to be Christian, while the African nations with the least LGBTQ rights and the most harsh criminalization laws tend to be Muslim. This is also true globally, and all of the nations in which homosexual acts are currently punishable by death are majority Muslim nations. This helps demonstrate that while social attitudes towards morality and ethics have become increasingly progressive over time in the global north, the global south has not experienced the same development. From the point of view of the global north, and please note that, well, it's an important qualification which applies to all that follows in this section, citizens in the global north are ethically privileged, while those in the global south remain ethically underprivileged. In the global north, the change from traditional pre-modern agricultural societies to post-industrial societies has been accompanied by an increasingly progressive attitude towards morality and ethics. By contrast, this has generally not happened in the global south, even among those nations which have become industrialized or post-industrial. So this is definitely not a simple difference between economically or industrially more or less developed nations. Neither industrialization nor economic development and growth correlate reliably with progressive developments in human rights, morality, and ethics in general, nor with progressive developments in LGBTQ rights in particular. The primary reason for the ethical difference between the global north and the global south is a difference in value systems. Generally speaking, citizens in the global south do not share the same values as those in the global north. This is a point made repeatedly by people in the global south who oppose the ethical developments which have already taken place in the global north, and who regard societies in the global north as morally degenerate, especially with regard to gender and sexuality rights. This is a point to which we will return later. Why does any of this matter? That question takes us to the second section of this video, which comments on the relationship between traditional indigenous views of gender and sexuality and contemporary views in societies of the global north. It's a relationship of curiously circular reciprocity. On the one hand, people in the global north often seek to validate LGBTQ rights by identifying historical precedents for them in traditional indigenous cultures. For example, supporters of LGBTQ rights in the US may point to the cultures of traditional American indigenous people as an example of historical tolerance of LGBTQ identities and practices. On the other hand, progressive members of indigenous peoples around the world, not merely in the global south, often seek to demonstrate that their traditional culture has always held to the values and LGBTQ rights of modern global north nations in order to validate that culture. The most important point to note in this circular reciprocity is the widespread agreement that the LGBTQ rights and values overwhelmingly promoted and or legislated by modern global north nations are the rights and values which morally good people should uphold. Progressive citizens of the global north want to prove these views are validated by historical precedent, and progressive indigenous people want to prove that their cultures have always held these views. Both groups agree that these values considered progressive by the global north are the values which morally good people should uphold. The extent to which this prioritizes and validates the values, concepts, and terminology of the global north, rather than values, concepts, and terminology of the global south, remains a point of contention in this discussion. It's similar to the way in which some indigenous cultures which previously identified themselves as tribes, specifically in order to differentiate themselves from the nationalist colonizers and imperialists who conquered and oppressed them, have switched to identifying themselves as nations, often First Nations, appropriating the language of the colonizer because it is seen as representing a concept of greater value. In North America, this switch in terminology from tribes to nations began as recently as the 1970s. For these indigenous people, it is necessary to see themselves in terms of concepts valued by the colonizer. They regard the term tribes as demeaning language, identifying less developed people, and the term nations as ennobling language, identifying more developed and sophisticated people. It was also seen as compelling the colonizers to treat indigenous people as peers rather than subjects, members of a sovereign nation state as understood by the colonizers themselves, and therefore entitled to all the rights of sovereign citizens who are independent of the colonizer's authority. The underlying assumption is that the language and values of the colonizer should be prioritized in indigenous discourse. The extent to which this is a valid or constructive approach is another matter of contention within indigenous communities. Again, this is a point to which we will return later. Now we come to the third section of this video. If modern global North values and legislation are to be validated by the historical cultures of non-Western people, and if Indigenous people wish to represent their cultures as historically holding to the values considered progressive by the global North, then the precise details of those historical cultures and their practices are of great importance. For example, if trans people are to be validated by historical precedent, which is a controversial strategy in itself, and yet another topic for later, then historical precedents must be found. This has led to both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people re-examining traditional Indigenous cultures and their history in efforts to find these historical precedents. As demonstrated in the first video in this series, this exercise is fraught with difficulty and sometimes results in controversies both within and between Indigenous cultures. On the one hand, overzealous non-Indigenous researchers sometimes attribute values to Indigenous cultures which never held those values. On the other hand, enthusiastically progressive Indigenous researchers are sometimes accused by their own community with overstepping the evidence of their own history and importing foreign terms and concepts in an effort to present their culture as more acceptable to the contemporary values of non-Indigenous people. Again, in my own personal experience with Indigenous people, I have seen these tensions and conflicts play out on both sides. In this section, we will look at the methods and challenges involved in studying the gender and sexuality language and concepts of Indigenous cultures. Firstly, the difficulties involved in using historical sources to identify historic and traditional Indigenous culture and attitudes to gender and sexuality. Secondly, the challenge of correlating modern non-Indigenous gender and sexual identity categories with those of traditional Indigenous cultures. Thirdly, the interpretation of Indigenous cultures by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers in colonial and post-colonial contexts. We'll start with the first point, the difficulties involved in using non-Indigenous and Indigenous historical sources for Indigenous culture. There are several challenges involved in this. One is the fact that culture changes over time, and the other is that historical sources of cultural knowledge can be difficult to verify. Broadly speaking, the cultural history of a colonized Indigenous people can be divided into three stages. First, the pre-colonial era original Indigenous culture. This is typically the least accessible to modern era researchers since it is the most chronologically removed and is usually preserved in imperfect records, either in the form of distorted reports by the colonizers or in the form of the fragmented reports of the Indigenous people themselves. Records preserved by colonizers are usually interpretations of their experiences with Indigenous culture rather than objective observations, and records preserved by pre-modern Indigenous people themselves are often incomplete due to a lack of systematic recording systems, such as writing, or the loss of information as a result of the death of oral record keepers or destruction by colonizers. As an example, let's consider the issue of seeking for records of homosexual identity and sexual practices among the Aboriginal Australians. The book Gay Perspectives 2, More Essays in Australian Gay Culture, edited by Robert Aldrich and published in 1994, recalls the discussions of a conference aimed at investigating the cultural history of Australian Aboriginals. Participants were overwhelmingly Indigenous themselves and commented on the challenges of reconstructing their own historical culture. Commenting on the unreliability of records written by the earliest colonizers, the book notes, quote, "The earlier reports were not written by trained observers, but by pioneers, missionaries, and early settlers, all of them white and male," end quote. The book continues, quote, "Their accounts are suspect for a number of reasons," end quote, noting that such records were often based on hearsay and were typically the product of intermediary informants, themselves also colonizers, who may have, quote, "fabricated their evidence in the interests of colonial politics," end quote. However, the book also notes that even Indigenous sources from this era should not be treated as completely reliable, observing, quote, "It is also necessary to take into consideration the possibility that the Aboriginal people who were the original sources of the data may have deliberately provided misleading information by, for example, giving exaggerated or fabricated accounts of practices they knew were shocking to Europeans, or by concealing particular kinds of knowledge." End quote. Secondly, the colonial era indigenous culture. This is more accessible to modern era researchers, but typically differs from the original indigenous culture since it has experienced modification and loss due to oppression and suppression by the colonizers and integration and assimilation of the indigenous people. Thirdly, the post-colonial indigenous culture, which has been reclaimed by the indigenous people through processes of decolonization. This is the most accessible to modern era researchers, but also typically differs significantly from the original indigenous culture, as it usually involves the process not merely of rediscovery, but also of reinterpretation of the original culture to meet the new contemporary needs of the original indigenous people. Very often, the post-colonial reclaimed culture is not only the product of intellectual tools provided by the colonizers themselves, such as systems and methods of decolonization, but also incorporates values from the colonizing culture, which have been internalized by the indigenous people, accepted as their own, and are now retrofitted to the records of their own original culture. It should be recognized that this is not a value judgment. All cultures change, and societies always develop their cultural values and practices in order to adapt to new social environments and situations. As a consequence, members of indigenous communities often disagree sharply among themselves as to the specific details of their original indigenous culture, and will argue over who has the correct interpretation of that culture. Returning to our example of the Aboriginal Australians discussing the challenge of LGBTQ issues in Aboriginal culture, one gay man, E.J. Milera, says, quote, "Growing up in the Aboriginal community, all I really knew was you grow up, you get married, and you have children. And basically, homosexuality is just not on. A phrase which is thrown around quite a lot these days is, 'It's not part of our culture.'" End quote. However, Milera and other members of the conference disagree with this perspective. Milera comments that in his view, Aboriginal opposition to homosexuality was the product of teachings by Christian missionaries, commenting, quote, "The missionaries got to the Aboriginal mob first." End quote. Now let's look at the second point, the challenge of correlating modern Indigenous gender and sexual identity categories with those of traditional Indigenous cultures. Validating LGBTQ people by finding historical precedents in Indigenous cultures is particularly difficult when those cultures simply did not recognize the same categories of gender and sexuality as modern cultures do. For example, someone in the contemporary global north, reading a historical record of an Indigenous man dressing in women's clothing, might conclude that the man was transgender. Alternatively, they may read of same-sex relations between two Indigenous men and conclude that the two men were homosexual. However, these conclusions are based on contemporary and ethnocentric frames of reference and may not represent accurately the categories of the original Indigenous culture. In that culture, a man dressing in women's clothing might not be viewed as transgender. In fact, the entire category of transgender may not even exist in that culture. Likewise, in that culture, two men having sexual relations may not be considered homosexual. They might be considered to be simply engaging in the kinds of sexual relations which the Indigenous culture considers to be normative for men who are attracted to women, men described in contemporary culture as cis-heterosexual. Returning to our example of the Aboriginal Australians discussing the challenge of LGBTQ issues in Aboriginal culture, one conference attendee, named Jim, notes that although there are some early accounts of diverse sexual practices in pre-colonial Aboriginal Australian culture, these accounts, quote, failed to provide a cultural context that would give us some insight into what these practices meant to the Aboriginal people concerned, end quote. Consequently, the speaker adds, quote, "It is hard to know how and to what extent the Aboriginal understanding of these practices corresponds to our contemporary notion of homosexuality," end quote. Later, Jim goes on to explain that homosexual relationships were viewed differently in pre-colonial Aboriginal Australian culture to the way contemporary non-Indigenous people view them. In the original Aboriginal Australian culture, Jim says, having same-sex relations, quote, did not entail the adoption of a distinct sexual identity, end quote. Consequently, a man having sex with another man wasn't a homosexual, he was just a man having sex with another man. Sexual acts were differentiated from sexual identity, so certain sexual acts did not necessarily identify a person's sexual identity. Stephen Carey, sociology lecturer at Charles Darwin University and queer activist, says that although there is evidence of male same-sex activity in pre-colonial Aboriginal Australian culture, including sex between older men and pre-teen boys referred to as boy wives, there is no evidence for sex or gender diversity. He notes, quote, "There is an emphasis on sexuality rather than sex-gender diversity, and when referring to boy wives, there is no implication that either partner is not man or not male," end quote. In this case, the boys are not called wives because they are gendered as girls or feminine, but because they serve the sexual function of a wife. The term refers to a sexual role, not a sexual or gender identity. Jim, the Aboriginal Australian man quoted earlier, supports this with his own statement that, quote, "The question of cross-gender or mixed-gender categories does not appear to be mentioned at all in the earlier literature, and this is probably because such categories were not present in Aboriginal Australia," end quote. So, although there is some evidence for certain same-sex practices in original Aboriginal Australian culture, there is no evidence for gender identity categories such as homosexual, nor sex categories such as trans and non-binary. The original Aboriginal Australian culture recognised only two sexes, man and woman, and two genders, masculine and feminine. In the same way, social roles in Aboriginal Australian culture were gendered according to a strict binary, with gender roles being identified with the terms men's business and women's business, terms which are still used today. As noted in the first video in this series, there is a real danger that enthusiastic efforts to identify historical precedents for modern sex and gender identities can result in the appropriation of Indigenous cultures by non-Indigenous cultures, and the imposition on those Indigenous cultures of non-Indigenous concepts, categories, and terminology which were never part of the original cultures. Now let's look at the third point, the interpretation of Indigenous cultures by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers. This takes place over three chronological stages: pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. During the pre-colonial stage, the original Indigenous culture is interpreted only by the people to whom it belongs. It is interpreted according to their frames of reference, and it may accordingly change and develop over time. During the colonial stage, the original Indigenous culture comes into contact with the culture of the colonizers. Typically, both the Indigenous and non-Indigenous people recognize a divergence between their two cultures. They differ to a significant degree, both in terms of values and practices. Also during this stage, the colonizers exert oppressive power in order to disrupt the Indigenous culture. As a consequence, that culture is usually suppressed and or replaced with the culture of the colonizers, though the original culture may still exist in a vestigial or modified form. During the post-colonial stage, the Indigenous people begin to reclaim their original culture through methods and processes of decolonization. However, the original culture is almost never recovered intact. More importantly, when it is recovered, it is typically far less different to the colonizers' culture than it was originally. The post-colonial Indigenous culture often adopts values and practices from the non-Indigenous culture, which is reinterpreted to integrate those new views. This reinterpretation typically results in a form of dislocation from the original culture and can provoke tension within the community between traditionalists who wish to preserve the original culture and progressives who wish to modify the original culture in order to incorporate the values and practices they have imported from the non-Indigenous culture. As mentioned previously, it should be recognized that neither of these positions is necessarily correct to the exclusion of the other. All cultures change and adapt, and divergences within a culture are also normative. In this post-colonial era, the Indigenous people typically interpret their culture using three different strategies. Firstly, preserving traditional culture by rejecting the cultural values and practices of the colonizing culture. Secondly, preserving traditional culture by reinterpreting it as conforming to the cultural values and practices of the colonizing culture. Thirdly, abandoning traditional culture and replacing it with the cultural values and practices of the colonizing culture. These three strategies are not mutually exclusive and are usually all used in Indigenous people's interpretation of their original culture. Now let's look at each strategy in detail. Firstly, the strategy of preserving traditional culture by rejecting the cultural values and practices of the colonizing culture. Some traditionally minded members of an indigenous culture may view adoption of non-indigenous values and practices as a betrayal of their own original culture and as yet another form of colonisation. Returning to our example of the Aboriginal Australians discussing the challenge of LGBTQ issues in Aboriginal culture, one conference attendee, named Wendy, says that being an Aboriginal lesbian, quote, often creates conflict in Aboriginal communities, end quote. Describing the friction this creates, she goes on, quote, in our case, we often cop that too many Aboriginal women are becoming feminists, the assumption being that this leads to lesbianism, which in some Aboriginal community people's view is not the Aboriginal way, that feminism and lesbianism is a white woman's disease, end quote. Feminism was never part of the original Aboriginal Australian culture and is typically regarded negatively by traditional Aboriginal Australians. Secondly, the strategy of preserving traditional culture by reinterpreting it as conforming to the cultural values and practices of the colonising culture. In this case, members of the Indigenous community identify values of the colonising culture with which they agree and argue that aspects of their own original culture uphold those same values. In the case of the Aboriginal Australians, a typical example is the modern reinterpretation of traditional Aboriginal gender roles. In original Aboriginal Australian culture, social roles are gendered according to a strict gender binary. These roles, known respectively as men's business and women's business, are reinforced through social control mechanisms, including threats and punishments. In contemporary non-Indigenous Australian culture, gender role segregation of this kind, especially along such a strict gender binary, is considered antiquated, regressive, and sexist. This represents a social challenge to those Aboriginal Australians who wish to preserve their traditional gender roles. A common solution is to interpret those strict gender roles in a positive light and present them as empowering for women rather than regressive. Anyone familiar with the history of feminism in Europe will recognise this as the same strategy used to oppose the early women's liberation movement. Thirdly, the strategy of abandoning traditional culture and replacing it with the cultural values and practices of the colonising culture. In some cases, members of the Indigenous community are explicit in their desire to modify the original culture and align it more closely with values imported from the non-Indigenous colonisers. In Australia, Alice Anderson, an Australian Aboriginal woman who used to be the government's Minister for Indigenous Affairs, says she opposes a return to the tribal punishment system of her people, which requires Indigenous people who break the law to be physically injured with weapons, such as clubs or spears. Anderson says, quote, our old laws were savage laws that existed at a time when we ran the desert. I speak my languages and I keep my culture, but that doesn't stop me living in the other world. What we want now is to move on, end quote. Similarly, although some original Australian Aboriginal cultures permitted men to have sex with preteen boys as young as 5, using them for sexual gratification until the men were married to women, modern Indigenous LGBTQ activists do not identify this as homosexuality and do not argue that this cultural practice should be preserved. Some other cultural practices which conflict with non-Indigenous cultural values are also being abandoned. Girls in original Aboriginal Australian cultures were typically married as young as 12 or 13, often to men more than twice their age. These marriages were obviously non-consensual from the point of view of the girl, who had usually been promised to the older man when she was a pre-teen. This would be illegal under current Australian law. Men were also permitted to have more than one wife, though women could not have more than one husband. Although these traditional practices still survive in more remote areas, often in a modified form to avoid breaking Australian law, they are typically abandoned voluntarily by mainstream Aboriginal Australian society, who now considers them to be unethical. Finally, in this fourth section, we will consider the relevance of validating modern LGBTQ people in the global north by citing historical precedents in cultures which are not their own. Do modern LGBTQ people really need to be validated by historical precedents? No, they are self-validating by virtue of their existence. This is not to say that such a search has no value. It can be personally affirming and validating for individuals to know that they are not chronologically or socially isolated. However, the contemporary sexuality and gender spectrum, with all its complexity, is a postmodern social construct of the global north, with no historical precedent. No society in recorded human history has had such a variegated view of sexuality and gender. Consequently, people with non-heteronormative sexualities and genders should not necessarily expect themselves to be represented in pre-modern indigenous cultures, and should not feel invalidated if they cannot find historical precedents.